This is Jim McGovern for Tellstar News. Our guest today is, once again, Senator Eugene McCarthy, and we're going to be discussing today about what the qualifications for the presidency of the United States should be, or let's just say the qualifications to be a candidate, first of all. And I understand you have some pretty interesting qualifications.
Well, I don't know.
I assume one of them is that you shouldn't cry before the cameras.
I think you have to watch those that cry, or if they are crying, you have to study the way in which they cry and the purpose that leads to it. But I have some more objective and I think realistic standards. It's interesting to raise the question because what we're doing now, both as candidates and even beyond that as the presidency, but principally the candidates, a very heavy and direct burden on citizens generally, without much intervention of party, for example, saying this is a party choice and therefore you can be for him. Rather, they present the candidate almost directly to the voter without any intermediary, or without the steps of representation which were sort of anticipated and assumed in the Constitution or in the procedures that were followed at that time. There are two reasons, I think, why it is so direct. One is the proliferation of primaries. So let the people pick the nominee. And the other is the increased use of television, so that the candidates come directly to the people, or at least for a picture examination. These are two things that developed, I think, most markedly after the 1960 campaign, when John Kennedy won the primaries, and as a result of that, he, in effect, established himself as the principal candidate. We'd had, earlier than that, Estes Kefauver, for example, in '52 and in '56, won primaries against the preferred candidate, Harry Truman, and against Stevenson, and the party just wiped him out. So the primaries had little impact, but in '60 they did have, and also it was generally accepted that the television debate between Kennedy and Nixon probably swung the election to Kennedy. And following that, the proliferation of primaries, of course, took place, and beyond the proliferation of the primaries, the increased use of television. So we're asking the voters to make these very direct judgments, almost face-to-face on first meeting with the candidates, and it's very difficult to do that. Since that's the way it is, and I don't see it changing very soon, I've tried to work out some rather general standards that should be applied. First, on the positive side, I think you should look to a candidate who has had some experience with the federal government, either in the Senate, maybe in the House, or actively in an administration, so that he has a knowledge of how that government operates. He should, of course, have a general association with the critical domestic and foreign policy issues, but it doesn't have to be very detailed. This thing of saying he knows the numbers doesn't necessarily prove that he'd make a good president. Thirdly, I think he should indicate that he knows how the federal bureaucracy operates, and especially the Pentagon, what the forces are that run in that body. And if he doesn't have this kind of knowledge and limited experience, it seems to me that you're picking a very high-risk candidate. On the negative side, which some of them bear on what I've said, I think that probably governors who go directly from the governorship to the presidency are probably the worst candidates, and that they bring to the office an arrogance, saying, I know how to run the state, therefore I can run the federal government. It'd be better if they had never run a state and came in modestly and with humility and said, we say in the Senate it took about 6 years for a senator who'd been a governor to get over being a governor. And that he had 6 years to kind of work it out. In the case of governors elected to the presidency, why they step in immediately. Well, almost so. I'll give you two examples, Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan, and neither of whom, it seemed to me, had a proper understanding of the presidency. A second category, I think, which is valid one for rejection, it was referred to by Senator Laxalt when he was still a candidate. I think he was talking about Bush. But he said vice presidents make bad presidents, and they may even make bad candidates. And I think there's some historical and theoretical justification for that. Oftentimes, a vice president is picked to balance the ticket, not because it was generally agreed he'd make a good president, but that he'd help to strengthen the ticket. Richard Nixon with Eisenhower, for example. Johnson with Kennedy. Bush with Reagan. It was supposed to, Spiro Agnew. I don't know why they wanted him to balance Nixon, but so the theory of it is if you pick two unbalanced people and put them on the ticket, you have a balanced ticket. And sometimes it doesn't work out very well. Well, on the record, that's the theoretical case. But on the record, we haven't had very good luck. We had Nixon and we had Lyndon, and we might have had Spiro Agnew. And the Laxalt case was that even if you pick a good person, he's likely to be changed in the vice presidential office. So that what you then get as a president is somebody who is not quite sure what he is because of what he was called upon to do when he was vice president. So we leave out governors now and vice presidents. I think it's safe to say we should have a pretty harsh judgment on ministers, and even non-ministers who make special claims to religious inspiration. I knew a politician who said that his last prayer every night with reference to politics was, "God save us from leading laymen." And that's not a bad prayer, I think, for if you're looking at presidential candidates. The fourth category, I would say, is someone of whom they say he knows the numbers. This used to be said of Henry Jackson. They're saying it about Sam Nunn. They said it about Robert McNamara, Stockman. It's kind of one of those phrases the press has picked up. And they say, well, he knows the numbers. You say, well, this probably means he's badly qualified to be president of the United States, because they get so preoccupied with the numbers that they don't make the big judgments. And the people who said Jimmy Carter would come in, on a defense matter, he'd have all the figures. He'd know how many missiles there were and what the kilotons and the megatons were. And all that information really doesn't help you to make the kind of decisions that presidents might be called upon to make. Those are the broad categories. I have some more refined points that you can apply if you want to.
Well, thanks very much, Gene. We'll come back and pick up on those finer points at a later date. This is Jim McGovern for Tellstar News. This is Jim McGovern with Tellstar News. Our guest again is Senator Eugene McCarthy, and we're talking about the qualifications for the presidency of the United States. Senator, this has been a very bad year for political candidates, and you might say their moral and ethical judgments. Is really this, I think this is the first campaign that I can remember that such an emphasis has been placed upon the moral conduct of candidates. For instance, we know of the purported womanizing of Franklin Roosevelt and John Kennedy, and I imagine there were others. But yet, in this day and age, it seems to be something that calls for immediate disqualification. What do you think? Does this business of personal morals, would that not show rather a human quality rather than one that's a negative one that should disqualify someone?
Yeah, on the first point, Jim, I think there have been campaigns in the past, in the turn of the century, where personal morality was an issue. Grover Cleveland, for example, and earlier than that. Of questions of personal integrity and I guess you'd call moral behavior. There's certainly been more emphasis on it in this campaign than any recent one, and I don't know whether it's out of hand or not. I thought the case against Hart was one which he invited and therefore had to answer for it. I think the Biden case was within the range of proper newspaper exposure. I think that the Dukakis one, if that's to be pursued, is pretty marginal. That this is not certainly not what was done there was not a disqualifying act. So it may be that most of that's sort of out of the way now, and they can get back to talking about somewhat more substantive and more important matters of character. I hope so.
What is your second category? We talked about your first category for...
Well, the first category really was the positive things they ought to know. The second was really kind of generally categorical, almost disqualifications. I mean, not really disqualified, but they ought to have to prove themselves if they come out of those categories. The fifth are of some substance. I think they apply when you're getting down to kind of fine-tuning. You've got a candidate who seems to be qualified categorically, but then you begin to look to particular actions. And one that I would apply is, does he make his announcement surrounded by, if it's a husband, by his wife and children, if it's a woman, by her husband and children.
And the dog.
And especially if they bring the dog. Yeah, I think if the dog is there, why, that's almost as serious as one of our major categories, categorical bases for rejection. I think you also take a hard look at anyone who says he's a speed reader. I think speed reading in the White House is a very dangerous practice because, first of all, most of the things that a president should read shouldn't be speed read, and if it's something that can be speed read, he shouldn't be reading it. So if he's not a speed reader, he's not likely to be tempted to that. I have a third category which said never trust him if you've discovered that he reserves the first seats in the second-class section of the airplane and gets on and welcomes everybody that's flying tourists, and then when it's over he slips up into first class and sort of has a first-class meal. There's an element of integrity involved in that I think ought to be questioned. And I developed a rather subtle one. This applies to senators and others. Is you know the difference in the technique of handling cows, as distinguished from how you handle pigs. This may be crucial. Zarfi and the Johnson weakness was that he tried to handle every issue as though it was a cow issue. And now to drive cows, you start as slowly as you can and you speed them up until you have them stampeding. You say nothing's going to happen. We're just going for a little walk. And the next thing you know, you got them running. It's sort of like Vietnam. With pigs, you have to do the opposite. You really have to panic a pig to get them going. Don't give them time to think about it, but frighten them and yell and be on the pen. But once you start pigs, you have to let them slow down very gradually. So when they get to where you want them, they think they've discovered it. And there's some issues that are pig issues and some issues that are cow issues. At a certain point, the Vietnam developed kind of into a pig issue, and when Johnson tried to handle it as though it was a cow matter, it just didn't work. But in any case, these are the two major techniques that a president ought to know.
Mm-hmm. Well, President Ford has shown that you don't have to be a good golfer to be president. But what about the professional athletes that seem to get the bug after they've found some success on the playing field? Then they think that that's an automatic key for them to run for political office.
Yeah, I think that at the presidential level, you really take a pretty hard look to be sure you're not picking the person because of some identification with sports. I haven't really worked out which sports are better preparation for the presidency than others. I would think baseball is probably the best.
More thoughtful.
Yeah, basketball is almost by habit. I mean, I don't know about power forwards in the White House. Set up a basket in the Rose Garden and shoot, but I haven't really worked this all out. But I would think something like baseball, where the person is pretty much always individually responsible might give you a better basis for judging a president. House members, maybe basketball players, even football players are all right. I'll have to work out a whole new theory on this one to be sure.
How about some of the other foibles that we find in various political campaigns? There seem to be musts. You mentioned the wife and the kids and the dog, and the second class plane tickets.
Yeah, speed readers.
Speed readers.
Oh, there are a few others that I think they're not really disqualifying, but they're things you ought to watch. Someone said he got a sudden inspiration, for example, when he was 12 years old, saying, "I'm destined to be president." And there's a new, it's sort of developed since Kennedy, the idea of claiming that you represent a generation, and that generation's time has come, or it hasn't been recognized, or it's the generation that ought to rule. I think it's highly questionable. Biden was into that a little bit. He'd discovered that he represented a very narrow little strain in the demography of America. He wasn't a baby boom, he wasn't a wartime baby, and he wasn't a baby boomer. There was a couple of years in there when neither of those general judgments applied, and in that slit he was born. And he sort of claimed that because of this uniqueness, they were entitled to govern, and he was to be the agent of their governing. And I think any candidate who says he's a product of sociological or demographic forces is suspect. If he says he was born out of lust or love or by accident, it'd be better. He'd be a better risk, I think, than if he said he was the product of these strange sociologically and historically defined forces. You'd have a better idea what the person was.
How about those that say they can change the course of hurricanes?
Well,
That
I
might be
don't
a
want to
good
quite
thing.
go that far, but I think one would almost have to be suspect in view of recent experience of anybody who says he's going to balance the budget or reduce the national debt. I think you'd have to look at him hard and have him explain how he's going to do it. But I would say that it would claim to balance the budget and reduce the national debt is a warning signal. So ask him a few more questions.
Who do you think, now that we've given this rather
Nobody left?
rigid test to the candidates, you think that there are any of them that would pass that are currently in running?
Well, there are not many left now. Those that are still in the field, I guess that they're almost all gone. We may have to, deal again and see what comes up in the next hand.
Is it possible that there might come over the horizon some dark horse
Well, I don't know.
wearing a
I
white hat?
thought 4 years ago or 3 years ago that Hollings, if I were to apply my categories, that he would probably be generally the best qualified candidate for the presidency in 1984 in that race. He didn't get the nomination, but that's the way it is.
They should have a
I think
seven.
the Democrats, there's still time. We didn't pick a candidate really in 1960 until it was April of election year. And here we're in October, November, December, January, February, March. There are about 6 months at least between the time now and the time we picked the candidate in April, although there are more primaries now and the timetable is slightly different. But I think there's still time.
And somebody just said recently, mentioning the 7 dwarfs, the candidates, and then they mentioned the 10 little Indians, and when it came to the end, and then there were none.
Then there were none. Well, there's still time for replacements. It could be like the National Football
maybe
strike. You may discover that one of the teams that filled in with teams that weren't originally chosen, they may find one was better than what they had in the first place.
Well, maybe we can get you on the bandwagon again. Would you be up to it?
Well, I don't know. You'd have to get organized
That is,
pretty
we'd have to
soon.
get some money.
Well, as I said, I guess you'd have to get some money. I don't think that's as serious a problem as has been made out to be with some of the candidates. Sort of the way you have to get it, or the way people think they have to get it. I think the whole process would be greatly improved if we could eliminate the federal election law, just completely. So let's go back to '72. I think we'd be better off politically if we could eliminate the vice presidential office altogether. I think it'd be a good idea if we could eliminate television political advertising. Just say let's not have any more of that. That would save a lot of money too, and you'd have to campaign somewhat differently. And I think that there's a need to change the procedures, both the state laws and the party rules, and that the whole operation could be not only simplified, but it could be reduced to sort of a presentation in which the electorate would want to make a decision and could make a decision. So if you can do all of that, more or less, why, give me a call.